One of my parishioners was recently lamenting that she's, despite being on this earth for a number of decades, she still couldn't understand why Christ had to suffer. And here we now also are approaching the end of the year with nature dying and the Day of the Dead and all of that in the Catholic tradition. Might be a good time to focus on the mystery of suffering. Now, suffering is one of those things that you can't talk about. Every time you talk about it, you have to wash your mouth out. That's what the Buddhists say about every time you say Buddha, you should wash out your mouth. Same with we Christians and God. Every time we say God, we should wash our mouth out. Because you don't know what we're talking about. And by the very fact that you're talking about it, you prove that you don't know what you're talking about because you can't talk about it. As Richard Rohr says, that the great mysteries of life, they're too deep for words. God, infinity, love, death, suffering, sex, have to be experienced. So we'll just touch here and there certain things about suffering that maybe can help us to grasp it. Now, not grasp it, but to be grasped by it in a fruitful way, because suffering is inevitable. If you didn't know that, you will soon. The religion is, again, as Richard Rohr says, religion is about what you do with your pain. So that's what religion is for. And if it's not doing that, it's not doing its job, or the Buddhism or Christianity. Of course, the Buddha started with that. Started with that experience according to the story of his life. Discovering, although they tried to shield him from it, you can't, ultimately, the mystery of death, of sickness, of old age. And as he says, if you're shot by an arrow, you don't discuss it, talk about it, you have to deal with it, immediately, existentially. And the Noble Truths, are about beginning with suffering, inadequacy, insufficiency. What do you do? How do you deal with that in life? So how to deal with your pain. And Christianity actually does the same thing, although we've uttered all sorts of foolish nonsense about Jesus' suffering and how it was a bloody sacrifice to appease the wrath of the Father and all this nonsense, as I say. It's done a lot of harm, which is why the poor lady couldn't understand it after all these years of catechesis. And Buddhists, rightly, I've heard them say, well, what is this with Christ and the cross and the suffering and all this stuff? Well, if you actually do look into the depths of... But both those men are saying the same thing. They're both showing us how to deal with pain. They're both taking on the pain, living human life, which... and pain is, suffering is the ransom of being human, as has been said. And they're showing us how to deal with it. Put in one way, Jesus, the way he suffered, showing us also how to deal with the pain of being alive, and that comes to us. How to deal with it. So they really are doing the same thing. And how we deal with the suffering is all important. And the male initiation rites, this men's rites of passage, which I had the privilege to do with Richard Rohr some years ago, he showed that the initiation into human life, how to live a human life, how to be able to live it fully and richly, had so much to do with how you deal with the suffering. One whole day was devoted to death and dying, mortality. What do you do in the face of that? How can you live humanly and fruitfully in the face of that? Second day was all about grief. Tears. As Virgil says, the tears of things, lacrimere, the grief, the loss, the inevitable pain of life, the inadequacy of life. And as Richard says, great love or great suffering, two of those mysteries that I mentioned, help to destabilize the ego. And that's one of the functions, if you want to speak at all. Why suffering exists, or what it can do for us, what it should do for us, is destabilize the ego. So we need to realize we're not in control, and then to let go of the control. Stop clinging, stop grasping. As the Buddha would say, stop resisting, stop recriminating, blaming. might say more clearly. And be faced, live with the mystery first. Don't run away, as Richard says, from your suffering until you learn what it teaches you. Now that's another pitfall, of course. Oh, suffering is there to teach us things. And it all sounds very glib and very cruel. But if you live it, not talk about it, but if you have to go through it, well, and do it without that resistance, as Eckhart Tolle would say too. It has to be an initial moment of acceptance. Not go into your head and resist, or into your accumulate pain, your pain in your pain body by resisting, blaming, as Eckhart also said. Then you can maybe learn what it has to teach you, why it's there, how it can be there, how it can be spiritually fruitful. So I wanted to share a text that I came across just yesterday that speaks very well to this mystery, how it's just to be experienced. I do have a couple of cards by my desk at home. One of them is, "What cannot be said will get wept." That's Sappho, which is what Richard's saying. You just have to live the grief. You have to process it, be in it. But here's someone who really did that. I'm not going to tell you who wrote it right now, at first. Unless you recognize the text and you know it already. I would bet that no one in 100 guesses would guess who wrote this. Anyway, here it is. It's about the revelation of suffering. Teaching. Out of my nature has come wild despair, an abandonment to grief that was piteous even to look at, terrible and impotent rage, bitterness and scorn, anguish that wept aloud, misery that could find no voice, sorrow that was dumb. I have passed through every possible mood of suffering. Better than Wordsworth himself, I know what Wordsworth meant when he said, "Suffering is permanent, obscure and dark, and has the nature of infinity." That's the experience of it. It's funny, even Sam Harris, the atheist, in his new book speaks about, well, in his case, speaking about a bad trip that he was on, darts, and says he knows, here's the atheist talking, he says he knows what hell is, and that hell always seems eternal. It's always going to be there, so we just heard. For an atheist, that's a pretty profound analysis of what hell is. Very few Catholic theologians go that far, get that far. While there were times when I rejoiced in the idea that my sufferings were to be endless, I could not bear them to be without meaning. Now what I find hidden away in my nature, like a treasure in a field, is humility. It teaches him humility. Not the dethronement of the ego. And an abandonment to the mystery. This is something bigger, obviously, than you can understand or control or handle. And suffering is any time you're not in control, as Richard said. So while pain is the ransom for being human, suffering, as I said, is optional. The resistance to it, all of that, turmoil, is optional. When you learn, as he said, to someone who suffered, the humility, the trust, the abandonment, and going to a deeper, another dimension of it. It could not have come before nor later. Had anyone told me of it, I would have rejected it. Had it been brought to me, I would have refused it. As I found it, I want to keep it. I must do so. It is the one thing that has in it the elements of life, of a new life. A new life being born, this is what we say, passion and resurrection. A vita nuova, a new life for me. Of all things, it is the strangest. One cannot give it away, and another may not give it to one. One cannot acquire it except by surrendering everything that one has. It is only when one has lost all things that one knows that one possesses it. There's a woman who helped him understand this, he says a little bit later. I remember talking once on this subject to one of the most beautiful personalities I have ever known, a woman whose sympathy and noble kindness to me is beyond power and description. I recall distinctly how I said to her that there was enough suffering in one narrow city lane to show God did not love man. That wherever there was any sorrow, though that of a child, think of the brothers Karamazov here, in some little garden weeping over a fault, the whole face of creation was completely marred. I was entirely wrong. She told me so, but I couldn't believe it. I was not in the sphere in which such belief was to be attained to. Now it seems to me that love of some kind, listen to this, love of some kind is the only possible explanation of the extraordinary amount of suffering that there is in the world. What? That's what he says. It seems to me that love of some kind is the only possible explanation of the extraordinary amount of suffering that there is in the world. One approaches the whole of history from a different standpoint. Sorrow, out of sorrow have the worlds been built. Wow. And at the birth of a child or of a star, there is pain. I am convinced that there is no other explanation, that if the worlds have indeed, as I have said, been built out of sorrow, it has been by the hands of love. Because in no other way could the soul of man, for whom the worlds are made, reach the full stature of its perfection. Now this guy has a right to speak because of what he's been through. Does anybody know who it is? What? No. Oscar Wilde. You may know that he suffered terribly at the end of his life in prison, died of exhaustion and sorrow when he was only 46. Grief can be the garden of compassion. That's what Rumi says in the other picture I have. It was a woman who taught him this lesson. As Richard Rohr says, women know suffering much better than men do, accept it and learn from it much better than they do. At the birth of a child, and we just hear. That's what they know. In the same anthology, there's a story of an old Mexican peasant woman, really old, who had been serving the family and had abused her for so long, and she finally is able to come to church. They wouldn't let her come to church. This is from Death Comes to the Archbishop by Willa Cather, famous book. But the priest, the bishop, was so amazed by her spirit of faith, joy, when she finally was able to come to the church. It says, "Never had it been permitted him to behold such deep experience of the holy joy of religion as on that pale December night. He was able to feel, kneeling beside her, the preciousness of the thighs of the altar, to her who was without possessions, the image of the Virgin, the cross that took away indignity from suffering and made pain and poverty a means of fellowship with Christ. Kneeling beside the much-enduring bondwoman, he experienced those holy mysteries as he had done in his young manhood. He seemed able to feel it, all it meant to her to know that there was a, capitalized, kind woman in heaven, though there were such cruel ones on earth. Old people who have felt blows and toil and known the world's heart and need even more than children do a woman's tenderness. And only a woman, divine, could know all that a woman can suffer. That's why even Buddhism has Avalokiteshvara, the god, the better bodhisattva of compassion, who, as you know, changes into a woman by the time he gets to China and Japan, and Kuan Yin and Kannon. Bisexual or transgender, if you like. And why, for example, in Tibetan Buddhism, you have White Tara, who, like Avalokiteshvara, has 1,000 eyes, 1,000 arms. She has 7 eyes, 3 eyes in one in her palms, 2 each in her palms, and 2 in her feet. Just like the openings of grace in the hands of the Virgin in Christianity. Or Green Tara, who assists women in childbirth and childbearing. All those figures are a reminder of the feminine energy that goes deep, really deep down into the matrix of the suffering that brings life, like the birth of a child. The best example of that for me, and I mentioned it once a long time ago, is the Virgin from the Cathedral of Nagasaki. You can look at this later. When it was atom bombed, this piece of the Virgin statue remained, but the eyes were burned out, and they're just black holes. The Virgin of Emptiness. It's from the black holes, the absolute darkness, that new birth comes, the compassion rises. The universe started in a black hole. It's out of that it came. The black hole of the womb, the black hole of the tomb, the resurrection of Christ. There are all these symbols of total darkness and emptiness and suffering from which the compassion emerges somehow in the universe. I think it's an image of God Himself in Christian terms. The Trinity is just a complete black hole from which emerge the giving and the dance. The dance, even in the midst of the suffering. Because of it. There was a Jesuit, French Jesuit, 20th century, Francois Vagnon. He wrote books called The Humility. We just heard that from Oscar Wilde. The Humility of God and the Suffering of God. We never don't think of that, do we? But there you are. The humility of God and the suffering of God. And he compared that, compared it to Christ. Swaddling cloths, being born into the world, the birth of that child, from the pain of the world, to the cross, the swaddling shroud. Both enfolding the human. And it was, he compared it to be, he said it was childlike, kind of like a childlike abandonment to the mystery of life, being born into the world and then even on the cross. Do we keep that childlike abandonment and trust in the face of the suffering of life? Do we surrender ourselves to it in a way that is life-giving instead of closing in on ourselves, on the ego? Vagnon compared it to Mozart in terms of music. Oh, I read that many years ago in the monastery, and it really stayed with me. Mozart, who in his Requiem, he died at 35, expressed such depth and suffering, but with a lightness to it, an innocence like a child. That's our goal. We can become truly like that. That's to resurrect. That's to deal with your pain. That's to know what it means. That's to know what it's for. And you have to experience it. And you will. But hopefully in the right way. So I just conclude with that verse from the John's Gospel. The world will laugh and rejoice, but you will be sorrowful. You'll face your pain. You'll be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn into joy, Jesus said. And then he added, just like a woman who's about to give birth has pain, But once she has given birth, she no longer remembers the pain for the joy that a human being is born into the world. So, I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice with a joy that no one can take from you. But the joy that no one can take from you can only come through the suffering. But let the suffering produce the joy. What do you do with it?